Last few weeks we've talked about decision making and the consequences of decision, and really the story of Ruth and Boaz is a story of loss and a story of love. It's a love story of how God provides in broken and hard times, and God's still faithful, God's sovereign. And then it also is a story of loss and consequences to bad decisions. So we've talked about making good decisions, how do you process your decision making, faith decisions. What does it mean to make faith decisions and to walk towards God? And so we'll talk some more about that today. And then waiting on God. All these things happen through the book of Ruth. And really, I think it's just a picture of Ruth and Naomi and how they have had just life happen to them. And they suffered great loss. And you find them in the first chapter, they're hurt and broken. And then how God, through Boaz, came and redeems that family, brings a new inheritance, and just changes the life story of these young women. And so that's really kind of an overview of it. And really what we see, and if you think through this, is we just see it's really normal life. Life really is about those things. So the question we want to ask is why do we know this story? Why this story? Because this story is full of loss. In chapter 1, we talked about that, is loss. And loss is very familiar to life. Like, we all have experienced loss. We could sit down with each one of you and you could tell us a moment in your life or some moments in your life where you lost maybe a parent, or you lost a friendship, or something was broken, and you're marked, like your life. Those are monumental moments in your life that you have, that you remember, that's familiar with all of us. We're all familiar with loss, and we are experiencing that now. We're in different phases of that, but we all have that and have those experiences. And then if we were to talk some more to you, love is probably a story that you have in your life as well. So if you go to my house and you walk down my hallway and you turn to as you walk down, there's some pictures there, and you'll see a picture of a wedding, and it really marks my life as love, like these moments. You can even go back, I think of the love of my family, think of love. So loss is a theme of my life, and so is love. How people loved me and how people have been gracious to me throughout my years of my life, and how people have stepped in. I could tell you stories of how someone has given us opportunities, or given us provisions, or helped us through difficult situations or struggles. And so all these is very familiar, and I'm no exception, and neither are you, and neither is Ruth and Boaz. Like, this is a very familiar story. And so the question kind of came to me is like, why do I know this story? Like, why did God show us this story? Like, why is this in the Bible? Why do we know it? That's kind of out of all the stories, and I'm sure in that time, there's probably other stories that were close to this one, but there's a reason why we know this story, and it really goes back to the genealogy. It goes back to who they are connected with. And so it's their legacy. It's their legacy, and we'll see that. So let me go ahead and read in Ruth chapter 4, verse 18. It says, "Now these are the generation of Perez, and Perez was the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram fathered Abinadab, and Abinadab fathered Nahishon, and Nahishon fathered Salmon, and Salmon fathered Boaz, and Boaz fathered Obed, and Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David." Now that David is a familiar person that we know in the Bible as well, and he was the man after God's heart. He was King David. He's well known, and so we see there's a connection between King David and Obed, so Obed actually is Ruth's son, and so this is connected to King David. So we're like, okay, so someone famous, right? Someone that's well known, someone that's important in the Bible. Well, if you go to Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, it starts to begin with Solomon, the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David the king. And then in verse 17 it says, "And so all the generations of Abraham to David," were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations, and from deportation of Babylon to Christ, 14 generations. Verse 18, "Now the birth of Jesus took place this way." And it begins the story of Jesus. So what's really the legacy of Ruth is the connection with Jesus. And Jesus really changed and makes her story a relevant story because of a few things. It foreshadows of what was to come, but it also captures our attention because Jesus is in the lineage of Ruth. the Moabite, the nobody, the zero, right? The someone that really didn't matter, that God would be sovereign enough and loving enough to bring her into his story. And so when I think about stories and stuff, I think of the first thing I just really want you to kind of think through is really Jesus changes your story. Right? Like, so Boaz and Ruth's story is just a great story. It really is. It's just a great love story. It's sweet. You see how, and it just kind of, again, reminds us of our stories. We can understand the beauty of this. But what really brings real beauty and real meaning to this story is the connection with Jesus. And I truly believe that if your life is connected to Jesus' life, your story now adds more beauty. Like, there becomes more meaning to your story. There becomes more purpose to your story. And so we see this. So really the theme today, what we want to really talk about, is linking our lives with God's story gives us confidence that our story will be remembered. And that's really, if you want a life that's remembered. And so as I get older, again, you can judge my age, but my kids are starting to get older. So I first think of the first few times. So my kids are now, like, my oldest is 15. So we're kind of in that, we're that pre-crazy stage, I think. I feel like, I don't know if it's coming. Some people have warned me, And so anyway, but I think of the early first 9 years of our life, when you just find out you're having kids, it just kind of like, dear Lord, we got kids, right? You're just kind of understanding you have kids. They're just you got to buy diapers and all that stuff. And I look back at those first 9 years, and I just think of being really tired. So I see people with babies, and I just feel tired for them. It's like, man, I'm just tired for you, because it was just busy and it was just tiring. And so, but then as they got older, and then also some things in my life happened where my dad passed, and I became the only male Snyder, that was to carry on the legacy of my father. And so it began to make me start to think through my legacy. And so we see the loss and we see the love of Boaz and Ruth, but then we see the legacy. And that's really the idea. What is our legacy? What does it matter? Like, what does it look like from here? God didn't just redeem us for us. He redeemed us for a purpose. He redeemed us with a purpose, with something in mind, something greater than just us. And so God has a plan for our lives, and God has restored our life and restored the blessings and forgiven our sins. Why? So that we might have a legacy that would honor Him and honor the people around us. And that's what we really see here with the story of Ruth. And so what Ruth begins to do is she begins to link her life with God's story. And when she does that, her life begins to have purpose and meaning. And so as you begin to link your life with God's story, your life begins to have purpose and meaning. And so as I think through my children and think through the legacy that we would have, some things have come up in my life, and I've started to process this. So what do I want my kids, what do I want their legacy, or what do I want to leave to them? At some point, there's going to be an end to my life, and then we see that even with Boaz and Ruth. There was an end to this love story, and then we see that it passes on to generation. So what do I want to leave to my kids? What do I want them to know? And really, I really want to connect my story with God's story so their story has meaning as well. And so a few things that happened. So as my dad passed away, there's some things that my dad has done or did do that when he passed away, I started to think through, what do I remember about my dad? Now, my dad and I, we didn't have a really close relationship as a kid, but as I got older and married and started having kids, our relationship began to mend a little bit. But there's a few things that my dad did, and one of those is he was a truck driver, so he would always say, when he was driving a truck, he would say, give me 50 acres and I can turn this rig around. Now, that's probably not profound to you, but I could probably turn a rig around at 50 acres as well. But the idea is that's something I remember of my dad. It's something that he passed on. I think about it. So anytime I drive a big truck or a trailer or something, I always think that same phrase. And I also, my dad brought me, was one of those things where, he sang the song, Hang Down Your Head, Tom Dooley. Now, you may not know that song. It's an old song, but that song reminds me of my dad. And I think about my dad, and I think, that's something that he left me. Now, I didn't mention this earlier this morning, but it reminded me again. So one thing that I do, if you're around me, my dad was a tuba player. And so my dad would always, what we titled, now it may not be the appropriate best statement or something to call it, but we call it the motorboat, okay? And so the motorboat is a tuba player, when they want to warm up their lips, they do that. So if you're working with my dad, he would do that. Well, somehow he passed that on to me. So if I'm thinking or I'm by myself or I'm doing something, you'll hear me. But what's funny is you will mock me, but probably by the end of the day, you too will be singing chorus with me as we both do that same thing. Why? Because it's contagious. It really is contagious. And if you're if you make fun of me about it, whatever, you probably will do it sooner than most people. But you will follow that, and that's something that my dad passed on to me. And my kids, I'll hear it. You'll hear that same thing, and you'll hear someone do that. So thinking of legacy, thinking of all this. We think about what do we want? Well, a couple things that Ruth did that I think that helps us when we think of our legacy is a couple things. First of all, what God did is God began to redeem her past. God redeemed her past. In chapter 1, I believe in verse 16, 15, 16, she says to Naomi, she's like, your God is my God. And so as she made that statement of faith, as she professed Christ, God redeemed her past. Now, Moabites were forbidden to the blessings and provisions of God. But not Moabites in general, but not Ruth specifically. Why? Because she had faith in God, and God never rejects faith. And so he responded to her devotion and her love. That's good news for us, because many of us have a past. And we needed to be redeemed. We have made mistakes. We've made poor decisions. We've found ourselves in broken and lost moments in our life. And so when you add Jesus to your life, when you have Jesus as the center of your life, he redeems the past. And so I can look back at some of the dumb things I did and think, man, thank God for God's grace. Thank God that he is with me in those broken moments. And so not only that, so she was a widow. She was a Moabite. She was very broken, but she's like, your God is my God, and wherever you go, I go. Your people will be my people. And so she made a bold faith, a bold step, and God honored that step. Not only that, but we see that she told the good story that she had was Ruth also let God use the present, the now. Like, I think a lot of times we live in the past or we look forward to the future. And so what Ruth really is doing here, she's letting God write her story. And just kind of backing up a little bit, Andy Stanley has a book called Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. And one thing he mentions in this book is he talks about that we're all writing our own story. We're all writing a story. Just like as we're reading Ruth, you kind of read through the pages, our story is the same. We have some loss and we have some love. We have a story we're writing. And so how do you know that? How do you connect your story to God so that your story will be remembered? Some stories are forgotten. Now I think of I want to call her Oprah, but it's not Oprah, it's Orpah. Orpah, remember, she was also had lost her husband, and she also, but she decided to go back. And so her story is not even mentioned. But we know Ruth's story, why? Because she had made a God decision. And so if you want your story to be remembered, and you're writing, we are all writing our story. Our story matters. And again, the idea is that the closer we connect our story to God's story, the better and more purpose our story has. And so as we link our lives to God's story, it gives us confidence that our story will be remembered. And so I want my story to outlast me. I want the generations to follow my life to say, man, our great-great-grandfather was a man of God, a man of character, a man that followed God. And so our grandfather was a man of God and a man of character. And our father was a man of God and a man of character. And so I will follow God and be a man of character. That's the desire that I have. And if you think about it, if you say it that way, is one way. But if you say that Shawn was a man of character, and Aaron was a man of character, and Aaron's son was a man of character, and Aaron's grandson was a man of character, that's where it becomes personal. That's when your story will be remembered. And so we think about that. So not only does God redeem the past, but he's in the present. We see it with Ruth. Remember, so she begins to make God's some faith steps, and she follows God. And then Boaz steps in and starts blessing her. And she come back with all this barley of grain, and she's got all this stuff. Why? Because God saw her and started to bless her in the now, in the present. And then not only in the present, but in the future. We see that God gives a future with purpose and direction. And so all that said is so how do we're writing our stories, we recognize that. How do we link our lives to God's story? Well, I think there's some things that we have to recognize and remember, that God is redeeming our past. And so I would encourage you to let God write a great story with your life. They let God write a great story. And so how do you do? Well, let him redeem your past. So I tell a story about my cousin. My cousin, and he was what I would consider the family bully. Now, he's the second oldest of all the cousins, and I'm the second youngest of all the cousins. So there's about a 9-year span between us. Our families were kind of all raised together in the same small town, and so we'd go to each aunt's and uncle's and house and whatever. And it was kind of chaos, and this was in the 70s and 80s, so this was like back when latchkey kids, we were raised by televisions and by ourselves. I say by wolves, but it felt like it, right? And so here was I'll give one story. My oldest cousin had shot himself with a BB gun, and I remember standing in line crying my eyes out because I thought he was dying because he had shot himself with a BB gun. That's kind of the story, that's the life that I lived, okay? And so here he was, he's like saying goodbye because he's dying from the BB gun shot. And I'm crying, I'm probably 3, crying my eyes out because I thought he was dead. And so anyway, so Bill, he was the family bully. Like for me, he like tortured me. I didn't have a good relationship with him growing up. We grew up and kind of separated our lives. He shows up to my wedding with his wife and kids, and I hadn't really known. And it was even a shock at that moment. It's like, why is he here? I don't know, but I'm a Christian man, and I'm going to just let him come to our wedding, right? And so anyway, it's been a while. So then we move away. God's called me to ministry, done some work in my life, and also God's working in his life. We moved back to Medford. We're coming back to Oregon, and he's like, hey, you're coming to Oregon, yay. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to see him, I was like, well, we're good now. Well, he actually had one of his sons had a football game coming to Medford. This is about 6 years ago. And so he's like, I'm going to come visit. He's in town. It's kind of the family thing you got to do, right? It's like, okay. And so he's coming. Now, I'm coaching my family, like, look, the family bully's coming to town. I just want you to know, if he bullies me or bullies you guys, we're gone. Like, we're going to kick him out. I'm not going to put up with that. No one's going to do that to my kids or nothing. And then what I didn't know is he was coaching his family. He's like, look, if Shawn's a weirdo, I haven't seen him for a while. I want to just kind of, I want to give some space. We'll just eat dinner. We'll go home. We won't have to see him again. So we meet, and actually it was incredible. Like, God had done some great things in his life. His family was incredible. His wife and my wife hit off very well. His kids were amazing. They're a lot older. They're older than my kids, but they were just amazing. Loved on my kids. Were very sweet, and I had the eagle eye watching any bullying around, right? I was just going to make sure. And so we just developed a friendship, a really good friendship. He's one of my best friends, and I'm very grateful for what he means to me, and he's been a blessing to my family and a partner to this church. Just been a real help to us. Well, starting to hear some of his story and how God redeemed his past and how God changed and God has done an amazing work in his legacy is, so when he was 38 years old, he was actually worked at a mill, and he was about to have his third child. And so at 38, having your third child's, kind of a shocking moment anyway, and the mill was closing down. And so here he was at that moment of what he did. And one thing he describes is, he says, am I going to live by fear, or I'm going to live by faith? And so he began to live by faith. He began to set out a goal and direction. He was going to help better his family. And this was actually, he's the first, him and I are the only ones with a college education past, I think, and then his daughter now, but we'll get to that in a moment. But so we see that he began to make some different decisions. And so as he's sitting there, and so he goes to school, and he gets a CNA, and he gets his RN, and then he becomes a nurse practitioner, and he specialized in mental health, and he's very well known in the Eugene and even in Oregon area of what he does. He travels all over, and so we see this, and we're like, man, that is amazing, and that is awesome how God has changed his story. And that really begins how he made God choices. Like he talks about how he made some God decisions, and God began to bless him. Now this was with hard work and effort. This doesn't just happen. He put in the time, and he worked hard to do that. And God has blessed him through that. But what's even more amazing is the legacy he's leaving. Because what really has attracted me to him is the way his children are. His children are amazing. We went on a vacation with him one day. Our kids were younger at the time. We pull in. His oldest kids grab all of our stuff, grab our kids, take care of our kids, fix us dinner, we eat dinner, they put the dishes away, and we sat down and I did nothing. And it was like, this is amazing. How did you do this, right? I'm taking notes because I want my kids to be the same way, right? And so he helped me. Riley Ann jokes, says, we were all good until Bill showed up and taught us how to work, So anyway, he's impacted my life. But what's more importantly, and what's beautiful about his story, is the impact he's had on his children and the legacy he's leading. So his daughter at the time when he was going to school and all that, she followed him to the nurse to each of the colleges she'd go to the daycares with him, and she'd see her dad study and go to all this stuff. And she began to see as he was making God choices, God was doing some great stuff in his life, and she witnessed that. Well, then at the point he said, it was great for me, but he's like, I wanted my kids to know what it's like to be successful. I wanted to help them and their walk. And so he sat down with his daughter at 15 and began to plan, because she had a goal. She's like, I want to be a pharmacist in the next 10 years. And so he had a goal. Now, she is amazing. She worked hard at this. And so she began to plan out, and she actually followed the plan. And I actually this summer went to a graduation party she's 25 years old, and she's a doctor, a pharmacist, the first doctor in our family. And so we see that the legacy that he led and the changes. Now again, those moments were hard. Those were difficult. It was out of that loss, out of that brokenness. He began to seek God and to follow God, and God redeemed his life. God changed the outcome, and he's changed forever, like the course of their life. Again, and it's more about his faith and the man of God he is that inspires me, and to see that not only can we change, but God does amazing things in people's lives. And that's the beauty of letting God redeem your past. God can change. God can do a work in your life. And then let God use your present. The beautiful thing about God doesn't just work in the past. It's not just stories of, what it used to be. God works in the now. God works today. God is working today in your life. This week we've suffered. I talk about the great suffering of 2021. Our AC went out. Okay. Now you guys may say that's nothing. It was harsh. It was harsh. It was a hot week. We were in there, and if we first got a first bid, it was going to be $8,000 to fix, and that's an incredible amount of money. And so we were praying. We were thinking. There was something about. There was just a peace about that God takes care of these things. It's just stuff, and it breaks, and if that's what we have to do, we'll fix this. But what God did is God just reminded me that he cares about the little things in my life as well. Our kids were joking, like, man, this is the misery, this is real suffering. And we're just joking because we have been so blessed. And one of my kids said this, like, God has been so good to us. Been so good to us. And that's really true, because he works in the normal, everything, inconvenient things in life. And just as he did for Ruth, he provided for her in her meantime. He provided for us as Boaz was working behind the scenes. God was providing for their needs today. And that's what God does. When you put Jesus first in your life, when you connect your life with God's direction, God blesses you in the little things. He cares about you. He cares about the worries you have. He cares about all those things. And so that's very comforting to me, to know that God worries about those things, but also the big stuff, right? We've had some big stuff that's hit our family. It always happens in seasons, right? There's always times, and you're not, if you say, well, we don't have anything happening this time, just wait a few months. There's gonna be something that happens in your life, and you're like, dear Lord, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? It changes. It does. One of my brother-in-laws was injured in an electrical accident, and so it was a very serious thing. But God showed up. God was faithful. God did some amazing things, and we saw God's hand again in the big stuff, in the things that you can't control. And really what that does is remind you, you're not in control of anything anytime, and God's got it all. God's got it, And so what we want to do is we want to link our lives to God's story, so that we have a confidence that our story will be remembered, that we can trust God in the everyday normal things. But then it comes the faith moment, and we trust God in the future, that we're trusting God for the future. And really this is where I think about the future of our church life. I think about, what are we doing here? So right now, it looks kind of sparse, not a lot of people here. But I'm telling you, God is doing a bigger thing than we could ever imagine or think. We've been praying about our residency program. So one thing when I came here, my heart was it's not about me, it's about the generations that come after me. that in my spiritual life, that I would actually impact young men and young women, that we would see the gospel not only be produced, but to go out to all the nations. And I believe every town should have a church that loves the community, that reaches into the community, and loves the people that God's put in that community. And I believe that God's growing up leaders. And so what's beautiful is with the residency, we, looking back, we just see the faith moves of God stepping in. And so God provided a house for us, for them to stay. God's provided some money for them to be able to come and to live. And so God's provided all these things. And so what's happened is we've seen, now we have 5 different people come in different desires. 6, I think, actually it's 6 now. And so we have Matt and Bella now that are residents, full-time residents. Cassie's come for 2 years from Arkansas. So God's moving. We have young people moving here. And what is the purpose? Is to grow them up and to send them out. Is to see what God does, right? Is to use their gifts and exploit them. No, I'm kidding. Is to use them and to encourage them, right? But they have ideas and desires to do that. And the heart behind this, if I think back in my own life and I think, what would I wish I could have had? Well, if I go back 20 years in my Christian walk, as I was called into ministry, I wish I had somebody that would walk with me, help me, give me some opportunities I didn't have. You saw Jordan baptizing this afternoon. The first time I was the first person he's ever baptized. There was one Friday afternoon. We were actually in here, 2 guys in the tub. That's a whole nother story. We were praying no one would show up. But what? We were doing that. And that's one of those highlights that I get to be a part of other people's journey. And that's what legacy's about. It's about pouring into other people. Instead of just saying, oh, it's all about me, it's about letting other people take their next faith steps and seeing that and being a part. Like, there's nothing that can take back that. We'll for the next 20 years, 30 years, him and I will have that chuckle. We are both in the baptistry on a Friday afternoon being baptized, right? As he's practicing, right? Because we want him to have confidence. And I look forward to not just Jordan, but many others that would follow, that we can help walk with them and to do greater things than we have ever done. And so this is what legacy looks like. And we see it in Ruth. We can follow her legacy, and we see that her legacy goes on to King David. And boy, did King David did far more than Ruth could have ever imagined, right? And then it keeps going on, and that Jesus would be in her legacy, that he would do even far more than King David, right? That's some big shoes to fill. And he blew those shoes out the door, right? And so there was hope in that. And so when we think of our future, when we think about what God is doing, we can be excited and we can honestly say with boldness, the best is yet to come. And this is what Jeremiah, this is when the Israel was collapsing. It was a sham, and this was the worst time in Israel's history. But in chapter 29 of verse 11, it says, God says this to Jeremiah. He says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, the plans of welfare and not for evil. I give you a future and a hope." And that's what we have when our life is connected with God's story. We have a future and we have hope. It doesn't matter what happens in normal life. It doesn't matter what happens in the future. It doesn't matter what happens in the world. We know that God is God and we are His. And so we can have confidence. And so as we face the loss of life and we face those moments of triumph and love, and we enjoy those high moments, and we face the broken moments, we can know that God is in the midst of all of that, and with the purpose to show and to share what Jesus has done in and through our lives. So, man, what a beautiful, beautiful story. And the reason why we know Ruth's story is because her story was linked with God's story. And that gave confidence that her story would be remembered. And so, man, my heart for all of us, so we look at our lives and say, Lord, the best has yet to come. And as we faithfully serve God, as we allow God to work as He redeemed our past, as He works through in the presence, and we look towards the future, that we can say, man, as long as we're connected to Jesus, man, that changes everything, and that gives us hope.